Hancock, what are your regrets over the past year? What do you reflect on that you could have done differently?
Well, I regret all of the deaths. I remember the very first one, and I remember feeling a deep sense of loss. And I found out about it when I was here at home and sitting down, and that really hit me. I remember at the start, we thought that you couldn't pass this disease on unless you had symptoms. And that's what that was the assumption, and that underpinned some of the early policies. And we've learned a lot. We've learned a lot as a society, and thankfully now we can see a route out of this. But it's probably been the hardest year this country's had for a generation, and
I wonder if one of your
everybody's been touched.
Yes, and that is absolutely true. Just wonder if one of your biggest regrets was that it wasn't taken seriously enough at the beginning. We seem to have a sort of sense of exceptionalism. It's happening over there, it's not going to hit us. And we didn't listen to the scientists. I mean, you say that asymptomatic transmission wasn't known about. Actually, it was discussed by SAGE scientists as early as February. We transferred too many patients from hospital into care homes without testing them. We didn't have enough PPE. Dominic Cummings has said, your department, the Department of Health, was a smoking ruin. And there were too many failures on PPE. Nurses and care workers were totally inadequately protected. An Imperial College paper suggested 20,000 lives may have been saved in the first wave if lockdown had been introduced just 1 week earlier. If we were marking lockdown a week ago, we might have saved 20,000 of those lives. When you reflect on those failures, what would you now fix?
Well, I think this point about the first point you make about about what's called asymptomatic transmission, not knowing that this could be passed on, I think that was incredibly important, and SAGE did discuss it, but they came to the conclusion that that we should assume that you couldn't pass it on. I was working on this as Health Secretary since the start of January last year, and for instance, developing the tests, which were absolutely critical, that didn't exist last January. So all the points that you raise, absolutely, it's important to learn from the future. We did have a challenge in terms of buying PPE, and we worked incredibly hard to make sure that we had as much as we had.
Why has Dominic Cummings, who was at the heart of government during that time, why has he described your department as a smoking ruin?
Well, I think he was describing how much work had to be undertaken to buy the PPE that we had to buy.
He was describing it as a failure, Mr. Hancock.
Well, the truth is that the department and actually across government, we were working incredibly hard to buy PPE because there was a global shortage and a global sudden surge in demand, as you can imagine. So that was the work that was undertaken. But the important thing, I think, is that we learn all of these lessons constantly. We've got to be looking always to improve our response, both learning from things that went badly and learning from things that went well.
So why not use today, for instance, why not use today to announce an immediate public inquiry? Because this isn't going away. Boris Johnson yesterday told us that we face the third wave. Infections are going up amongst our European neighbours. If we really genuinely want to learn the lessons, and we want to get to the truth, for instance, about the fact that SAGE said asymptomatic transmission cannot be ruled out on the 4th of February last year, if we want to get to the truth of the millions handed out for PPE contracts, which unfortunately meant that NHS workers and care workers didn't actually have PPE at the beginning. If we want to look at the failures over care homes, why don't you announce the inquiry now?
Well, because we've got, precisely as you answered in your own question, there is still a great challenge. We've got the roadmap, we've got the route out, we've got the vaccination program going incredibly well. We've got to work on all those things to get us out. Of course, there'll be a moment when it's important to look back and have an inquiry, and that's fine.
We don't want to make any more mistakes. I think that's what people, a year into lockdown, we do not want to see any other mistakes. We need not at some point in the future to look back and say we must never do that again. We want to do that right now.
Yes, in fact, I think I agree with you very strongly. We need to do that at all times, and so we have.
So would you welcome an inquiry sooner rather than later then to ensure that doesn't happen? Because you can understand what Susanna's point is. It just seems very convenient for the government at the moment to be saying, now is not the time, now is not the time. We're into the lockdown now. We know that there's a third wave coming from Europe. When is going to be the right time?
Well, there will be a time, but the most important thing is that we constantly learn the lessons. So I think actually it's a bit of a, there's two parts to this. You've got to learn the lessons all the way through. And then afterwards...
What are you afraid of by having the inquiry sooner rather than later, though? It sounds like the government is scared. We were reading yesterday that the inquiry could well get kicked into the long grass, so we don't see the results till after the next general election, because that, of course, would suit the Conservatives, that would suit the Prime Minister.
No, I don't think that's right at all. And I don't know what you read, but I haven't seen that.
So you think it's going to come within a year, is it? Is it going to become before the autumn?
I think it depends on circumstances. As you know, and more importantly, as everybody watching this knows, we're working incredibly hard right now to keep the country safe. And that means looking at what has gone well, looking at what hasn't gone well, doing everything with the best possible judgment on what are some really big calls. I mean, if I just pick up on a couple of the suggestions that were made, for instance, we of course have learned the importance of having onshore supplies of PPE, for instance, and now 70% of our PPE, other than gloves, 70% of our PPE is manufactured here in the UK.
Can I ask you about a couple of things which are... Yep, well done. And it was way too late. Can I ask you about...
An example.
We haven't got very long with you, and I want to ask you about care home vaccines, because one of the things that you've mentioned is the vaccination programme being so successful. Are care home workers going to be forced by law to have vaccinations?
Well, the vaccination programme, like what I've just said about PPE, are examples of things having been, things that we have where we've got to learn from when things have gone well. And the vaccination programme has been unbelievably successful. And we are looking at whether, like doctors have to have the hepatitis B vaccine, we are looking at whether it should be required.
We heard from a care home manager earlier, Mr. Hancock, if you are looking at trying to make it mandatory, to saying the recruitment is a nightmare in the care home industry at the moment already. And if you do make it compulsory, people are going to leave that industry.
Well, no decision's been taken, and we've got to take into account all of these things. But I'm glad to say that recruitment is up in social care, which is good news. But crucially, we also have a duty of care over the people who are in care homes. So both sides of this have to be taken into account, and we've got to talk to people in the sector. There are many in the sector who are calling for this to happen because a legal change would be required, and it is something we're considering.
And you're considering it, that suggests it's likely. When would it be introduced under consideration?
Well, no decision has been taken, so there's no date or timing on this because it's something that we've been looking at, but we haven't come to a conclusion on.
And just finally, before we let you go, are you concerned about further delays to the vaccination programme because of the row over AstraZeneca with the EU?
Well, on this, my view is that the most important thing is for people to work together internationally. It's just so important. You know, these vaccines, the supply chains are essentially global. I'm very, very glad that we took the decision to have a very significant proportion of the Oxford AstraZeneca production onshore. But nevertheless, we work with international partners right around the world on this. And I think that is the best approach, not putting up borders.
OK. Health Secretary, thank you for joining us this morning.